Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us. This weekend's triple stabbing in Chinatown is drawing outrage from Premier David Eby. The man arrested had been on a day pass from a forensic psychiatric hospital. We'll hear how Eby and the opposition are tackling this incident and the issue of crime. On the open line, BC Cap's rental increases to 3.5%. What does that mean for you? Plus, Health Canada approves the updated Moderna COVID-19 vaccine. We'll take your questions after 12:30. I'm Michelle Eliot. Welcome to BC Today. Thank you for joining us on CBC Radio 1, live streaming as well on CBC Gem, cbc.ca/BC, and on the CBC Vancouver YouTube page. Later in this half hour, we're going to take your questions and your calls about how you're feeling about the province's decision to allow residential rents to increase by up to 3.5% next year. That is the cap that's been set for next year. How will that affect you? We want to know what you think is a reasonable increase, whether you're a renter or a landlord, and what actions does the province need to take to support both landlords and tenants. That's coming up in a few minutes, so get ready to give us a call on that. But first, some political analysis now as political leaders in BC are reacting to the triple stabbing at the Light Up Chinatown event in Vancouver. A 64-year-old man has been charged with 3 counts of aggravated assault after the attack. Premier David Eby told reporters this morning that the circumstances make him furious. Take a listen.
I am so angry. I am white-hot angry that this person was released unaccompanied into the community to have a devastating impact on all of the hard work of all of these community members. I cannot fathom how someone who murdered his daughter, was released in 2009, went out and stabbed somebody else, would then be released again, unaccompanied, somehow able to go out and buy a knife, go to Chinatown and stab 3 people. How is that possible? And so I can assure the people who were the victims of this attack and their families, everyone who is impacted by this horrific event, that our government will get to the bottom of how this happened, and we will do everything we can to make sure it doesn't happen again. I just cannot imagine how this happened. We will ensure that an independent person looks into the specifics of this case, the decision-making process, how we arrived at this awful place for Chinatown, for the community, for the people who were attacked, and we'll make sure that there's nobody else that's on a day pass that's in a similar situation to ensure that the community is safe. And that work is already underway. And all I can say is that I'm sure it boggles the minds of all British Columbians, as it does me, that a series of decisions could have been taken that landed us in this place.
Premier David Eby speaking this morning. Meanwhile, BC United leader Kevin Falcon is also responding to the incident in Vancouver. He spoke after the Premier's comments at a press event to launch BC United's plan to tackle public safety concerns. And Falcon says the public needs to know more about the decisions that led to the suspect's day release.
It's obviously very concerning when you've got an individual who's in care at a forensic psychiatric institute attacking strangers while on a day pass. And we're certainly calling on the Premier to make sure there's a full investigation into how this could have taken place given that individual's history. After 6 years on the job, this NDP government has fundamentally failed on the duty that is most important for a government, and that is to keep people and communities safe.
That's Kevin Falcon speaking this morning following David Eby. Well, my guest to discuss this is Rob Shaw, political correspondent for Czech News and a columnist for All Points West and Radio West on CBC Radio. Rob, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me on.
Well, you heard those comments from both Premier David Eby and opposition leader Kevin Falcon. The incident certainly becoming a political focal point. What do you make of their comments today?
Well, politics is all about timing, and this is very interesting timing. I know BC United was planning this last week, and yet we have now this sort of renewed emphasis and heightened anxiety from the public based on those the triple stabbing at the Chinatown Festival on Sunday, sort of becoming the frame from which we're looking at this issue once again. And BC United has constantly pushed this government on the issue of public safety. It feels that it is a vote-getting issue for its constituents, for its supporters. And this crime package that they've put out today, they've been hinting at and talking about for many weeks now. It pulls together all sorts of concerns on the areas of decriminalization, on the areas of police shortages, on the so-called revolving door of people who come in and out of the justice system and keep committing offenses, on the shortage of crown prosecutors, on all sorts of things, into a cohesive plan that it drops today as we are talking about the crime issue in downtown Vancouver. And we've been talking about that in the past too. So that framing of it makes for a very visceral discussion today.
Yeah, and they've certainly, leapt at this opportunity. What does it say about how they have been tackling this longstanding issue?
Well, I don't think it was done on purpose, but I think that certainly BC United will benefit from the timing of it today. And they view it as an issue that voters could cast their ballots on in next October's provincial election. I'm not sure if that will be the case. We haven't seen public safety take on that level of importance in the last two by-elections that we had earlier this year. People are very concerned about affordability, about healthcare, about other files, but it's certainly an area of emphasis from the opposition. And I think one of the biggest promises in this action plan that may cut through the sort of public fatigue on listening to politicians talk about this is a promise from BC United to end decriminalization. And that is something that was brought in by this provincial government in January with assistance from the federal government to decriminalize personal possession of small amounts of illicit drugs. And the idea was to destigmatize possession of drugs for those who are suffering addictions, therefore helping them approach a police officer or a law enforcement person and get help. The counterpoint to that from opposition and other critics has been that it's allowed the proliferation of open drug use in parks, on beaches, where there are fewer penalties, and the bylaws are simply not up to the task of cracking down on that. And so this promise to end decriminalization is a big one from the opposition, and they're hoping that the public will hear that, and maybe they don't even know what the name of the opposition party is because it changed from BC Liberal to BC United, but they'll stick with that idea in the months ahead before the election.
Now, on this incident, the premier said he's promising to look into this. There will be a review, independent review, though when he was asked, he said that he didn't have details of that yet. What can the public expect? I mean, he's promising action, it sounds like.
Well, it's a complicated area of jurisdiction because there is already an independent BC review board, and it has psychologists and accredited officials on it who are making these types of decisions. And so the premier promising an independent review of the independent board, because basically that's really his only option at this point, is to do a review of how this could happen. It is not the first stabbing we have had, unexplained random incidents of stabbing and violence in downtown Vancouver. The opposition, I thought, was very careful today, Kevin Falcon, to not blame David Eby per se for this incident. I think recognizing that there were other people who decided to gauge the psychiatric ability of this person and give him that day pass, but blaming him in a larger sense for the public safety system that allows this to happen again and again, whether it's someone who's arrested for vandalism and then out within hours, or arrested on something else and then out and committing another crime. One of the promises in the platform is to crack down on all levels of crime, from shoplifting to theft to other things that aren't prosecuted right now. And then a really interesting one that I think the public might seize upon a little bit too is that if you are found to have committed a crime, you've been found guilty, you can choose between a jail sentence in BC provincial jail, if it's a provincial crime, or a secured addictions treatment sentence if you are suffering addictions, where you would be in a facility either within the jail or outside the jail where you'd be treated for your addiction. So you're not in the revolving door of coming out still addicted, feeding your addiction with crime, and then back in the system. That's different and new. and the opposition hoping the public might want to hear more about that as well.
Okay, certainly a long-standing issue, as you've just described. And Rob Shaw is my guest this half hour on BC Today, political correspondent for Czech News, also a columnist for All Points West and Radio West on CBC Radio. And do stay tuned to CBC Radio 1. Online as well, cbc.ca/BC, and tonight's CBC Television News for more reaction and more coverage and political analysis of the reaction from the BC Premier and BC United leader Kevin Falcon with regard to the issue of crime. Much more coverage on that from CBC. Now, the big story yesterday politically, another big story as well, was on the rent increase cap that was announced by the BC government. So landlords in British Columbia will be allowed to raise rents by up to 3.5% next year. Now, the province says that's below the 12-month average inflation rate of 5.6%, but it is higher than the cap, the maximum allowable increase for this year, which was 2%. Now, the CBC spoke to renters in Vancouver and got their reaction to that decision.
I can't believe that. That's insane. I already pay so much money for rent. It's already like half my paycheck. Like, that's just ridiculous. They need to make more room for people to move into the city and lower the rent.
It does increase my rent, and I think it's becoming more and more unaffordable.
I don't know. I believe in the market economy. I think it's just supply and demand.
Now, in Vancouver, the average cost of a one-bedroom apartment is about $3,000, according to rentals.ca figures just published today. A 3.5% increase to that would add close to $1,300 to a tenant's annual bill. We are asking you about this today. What do you think of that cap on rental increases in BC, set at 3.5% next year? How will that affect you? And what do you think is a reasonable rent increase? What actions do you want to see from the province on rent? CBC.ca, BC Today at CBC.ca is our email. Our phone number is 1-800-825-5950, 604-669-3733. You can also hit pound 690 on your cell phone. And before I go back to Rob Shaw on the political analysis of this, let's just take a call from Dave in Vancouver, because Dave, this does affect you.
Yes, it does. My rent right now was increased to $1,300 from $1,000.
And when was this increase, Dave?
A couple of weeks ago.
Just a couple
of the month.
Okay.
Yeah, the 1st of September.
Now that is quite a large increase. How did that happen?
Well, we weren't going by the regulatory things. I actually first started off, it was about $850 a month. That was about 12 years ago, 13 years ago. And then finally, 5 years ago, they wanted to increase it. So I said, well, what would be right for you? So $1,000 is what we decided. So I've been paying $1,000 for about 5 years. And now they wanted 13 because everybody's getting, $2,000 a month for basement suites. And
okay. So are you able, I mean, it sounds like it is more than the cap. So have you been able to make a complaint?
No, I'm not going to complain about it, but because everybody else is charging $2,000 and $2,500 for it's a 2-bedroom, but the bedrooms are quite small. The second one's pretty small. But after being there for 14 years, I'm not complaining about that so much, but I just think that this rent increase is just, adding vinegar to your wound. It's just not something that should be happening. We got in this position years ago, 20 years ago. It started because everybody wanted to be a millionaire owning a house. And those prices kept going up. I know it's supply and demand and speculation, everything that led to that. But that increased everybody's rent to where it is now, which how can people pay their rent? I make about $4,000 a month clear. And if you work at Starbucks or places where they pay them 16, 17 in that area, they only clear about $2,000, $2,500 a month. Yeah. How can people expect to pay rent when you have people that have jobs like that? Like, this has got to stop. We should be decreasing the rent. We should be decreasing the value of the value of houses. It should be still $500,000 for a nice house. Why is it $1.7 million? That's way overpriced. Everything is just out of control. I don't know
Well,
where it's leading to. I really don't.
Dave, can I just go back to your rent increase? It sounds like you
Yeah.
don't want to make a complaint about it because you've been there, and rents elsewhere are going to be around that. And so it sounds like you're concerned about your stability as well, right? You don't want to have to leave.
Well, that was it. I mean, if I didn't agree to paying about $1,300, maybe the landlord would have said, I'll just give you a rent evict, and then where would I be then? I wouldn't find anything for less than $1,800 or something like that. And if I could even find a place. So I pretty well had to make the decision to go with it, right? But I don't think it's right that this is the way it is. We'd have to change the structure of the value of real estate.
Okay.
And this world's got to do that. If they don't start changing this, they're not going to have people working at gas stations because there'll be nowhere to work, nowhere to live and afford it.
Okay.
You can only nickel and dime the people that don't have much money so much, and then we're going to head for disaster. Okay, that's all I want
Dave,
to say.
yeah, thank you very much for your call.
Okay.
And that's quite a specific situation that you're in, and a sticky one, not wanting to have to move, so complying with quite a large rent increase that is above the cap. Rob Shaw is with me, political correspondent for Czech News. What do you make of that? I have not heard that before, but his point is that where am I going to go?
Yeah, well, I think in that case, without the actual
We don't have all the details.
residential
Yeah.
agreement, without a signed agreement, you're sort of at the mercy of a landlord who's doing whatever they want. But it is even a 3.5% rent increase is difficult for people when you have these massive rents already. The issue I think the NDP government found itself in is that it is worried from the landlord side that because inflation has increased the price of utilities and different things like that, according to Housing Minister Ravi Kahlon, if they hadn't allowed this to go up at least a little bit, that they could have had people who stopped renting their places. Yeah, I mean, you're going to have, I think people have to make their own gut check about whether they believe that or not. It's certainly the government trying to balance the interests of the landlord and the renter. There is certainly people out there right now who made a good amount of profit on renting their places, who are seeing their mortgage rates go way up with the rate increases from the Bank of Canada, who now are finding they can't pay their mortgage with the rental income that they're bringing in and are struggling with that. It's very, very complicated, the different factors around housing. If you talk to the premier about this, he will tell you he traces it back to a lack of building rental buildings, that the feds got out of that game, that the province and developers didn't do anything for many years, and there's just not enough purpose-built rental buildings. And he wants to see tax breaks for that as well. You can go on, but a lot of the solutions are going to take years. And in the meantime, we end up with 3.5%, 2% last year, continued stress on renters every single year. It could be worse, right? It could have been worse if the law hadn't been changed in 2018. The previous rent cap would have been the rate of inflation plus 2%. So it would have been 5.6 plus another 2, although government, I think, could have used its discretion there. This is less than that, but it's still tough for people to swallow for sure.
So have they come to a moderate middle here?
That, I think, that's going to be a question for voters, whether they feel this is fair. That people would have liked to probably have seen 2% again. Landlords wanted it to be the rate of inflation. The government's indicating that in the future after this, they want to go back to the rate of inflation. They can't artificially step in every year, take this formula and just kind of cut it out at the knees. There will be, potentially consequences to the rental stock for doing that. So the government signaling this is the last time that it intends to put its thumb on the scale. It was 0% during COVID. So if you are a landlord and you're looking at your rent versus your inflation, I guess you have an argument to make that you're having a harder time keeping up, and government is sensitive to that too. But it is housing, like the larger point of your caller about housing being unfair, structurally unfair. That is something people express to politicians all the time. And the unfortunate reality is the political promise that comes back from all parties is we're going to make housing more affordable for you. And it doesn't mean they're bringing the price of housing down. No party is promising to bring the price of housing down. They are only promising to slow the growth of it. And that's hard for voters to get their minds around when they hear the political rhetoric from politicians.
The value of real estate, yeah, was the larger point from our caller there. Let's go to our commenters now. Before I go to Roman in Port Alberni, here's an email from Linda in Victoria. I share the concerns of many who find rents unaffordable in our community. For several years, I have owned a rental property with 3 suites. Our tenants are wonderful. We provide the best we can to make their homes comfortable. It seems to be working as they have resided on our property for several years. And that makes it almost unaffordable for me to hold on to the property. The tenants pay half of what they might pay for reasonable rent in today's rental market. My costs, though, have increased every year, particularly insurance premiums. At this time, the property maintains itself in terms of cost unless a new appliance is required or a major repair is needed. If there's a point where I have to subsidize the cost of the property, I will be compelled to sell, and that frequently does not end well for tenants. Thank you, Linda, for that email. bctoday@cbc.ca is our address. Our numbers as well, 1-800-825-5950, 604-669-3733. You can hit pound 690 on your cell phone. Love to hear from you. 3.5% cap on rent increases for next year. And the province says that is below the inflation average over the 12 months. But it is more than the cap that was set for this year. So how would that affect you? Love to hear your calls and your thoughts on this. Roman is waiting in Port Alberni. Hi, Roman.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. What are your thoughts on this rent increase cap?
I think it's a wonderful one-pronged approach to what I hope is a multi-pronged overall approach to mitigating the cost of living for those that were described by your previous caller, where, having a place to live is basically the essence of establishing your identity. You're either a person with an address or you're a homeless person. And how do we view homeless people? We view them as nothing. And that's just in broadest brushstrokes possible. You don't have an identity without a home. So my thought is, why aren't we treating this as critical as it actually is as an infrastructure? We can force legislation to get workers back to work if they're considered, what do we call those?
Essential workers?
Essential workers. Why isn't this considered an essential issue for resolution?
So
sorry?
Sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say, there has to be ways and means of attacking this at the front end of it, the development of housing in a way that best serves all of the people that are going to be needing a place to live, not just the well-dos, the Dows and the Joneses, but those that can only rent, those that, don't really have any other option but to be on the street or be in a SRO or anything that is within their grasp. So why are we not, is there something being done? I shouldn't offhandedly say, why are we not? Is there an effort being put in other prongs to this approach of mitigating the cost of building housing, mitigating the cost of real estate development, and actually establishing homes for all?
Roman, thank you very much. And let's wrap up with that from Rob. Earlier, Rob, you talked about David Eby pointing to the federal government for not having built purpose-built rentals over, the past recent years. So when it comes to a multi-pronged approach, building rental housing, I think is what Roman is pointing to provide and to address the needs of renters. What progress is being made on that?
Well, the government is appealing to the feds for different tax breaks. I mean, it all comes down to profit. It is more profitable to build condos than it is to build market rental building. So you have to incentivize the development industry to do it, or you have to do it yourself as a government. And we're getting around to the point where governments are trying to do it themselves now, because adding certain numbers of affordable units into an expensive condo development isn't working. I'll just add, because no one really says this out loud, but it's important, I think, to remember, the single biggest investor and speculator in British Columbia's housing market are British Columbians. They are ordinary British Columbians, families that own a second condo or a home or a rental property. And for a government to suddenly step in and tank those property values down or limit, I know that it sounds like a solution, but there would be massive repercussions to it. And I think that's why we never see governments do that, because the biggest driver of speculation and investment in this province is us. We are all the speculators and investors, the people who own, who rent, who choose to rent for the amount that they rent for. And so that is a difficult conundrum for governments to get their heads around. It's not foreign buyers, and it is not a cartoon villain or an enemy. The people who own all of these condos and buildings that are renting them at high rates are people in your lives, and that is difficult for government to tackle.
And that's why this issue is, cuts so close to the bone for so many people across BC, right? Regardless of where they come at it from. Rob, thank you very much for joining us on both big stories today. Really good to have you.
Thanks for having me.
Rob Shaw is a political correspondent for Czech News, a columnist for All Points West and Radio West on CBC Radio. It's 12:31, 1:31 in the Mountain Time Zone. You're with BC Today here on CBC. I'm Michelle Eliot. Thanks so much for joining us. Very nice to be with you. Coming up in our next half hour, Health Canada has approved an updated version of Moderna's COVID-19 vaccine. We'd like to hear from you, your questions about this vaccine and how to protect yourself this coming respiratory season. We'll have two medical experts joining us to take your calls. That's coming up after the CBC News Update with Robert Zimmerman.
Good afternoon. As you've been hearing on the show, Premier David Eby says his government will review the circumstances surrounding Sunday's stabbings at a Chinatown festival. The suspect, 64-year-old Blair Donnelly, was out on a day pass from a psychiatric center when he allegedly stabbed 3 people. He was found not criminally responsible for the stabbing death of his 16-year-old daughter in Kitimat in 2006. A few years after that, he stabbed another person on an unescorted release. Provincial officials are breaking ground today on the new Surrey Hospital and Cancer Centre. It's expected to be completed 2 years later than originally projected and will cost $1 billion more. The healthcare centre is now slated to be finished in 2029 with a price tag of nearly $3 billion. And as Michelle mentioned, Health Canada has approved an updated version of Moderna's vaccine to protect against COVID-19. It will be available to all Canadians over the age of 6 months. And now the BC forecast. Air quality statements continue for several areas due to wildfire smoke. On the north coast, the chance of showers this afternoon with a high of 15. Highs reaching 23 with widespread smoke in the Peace. In the central interior, a high of 15 with showers and local smoke. Highs in the mid-20s with a mix of sun and cloud in the Kootenays. In the southern interior, increasing cloudiness this afternoon with a high of 24. And for Metro Vancouver, Greater Victoria, and the Fraser Valley, mainly cloudy, a chance of showers in some areas with highs around 18. I'll have more local news at the top of the hour. Now back to Michelle with BC Today.
Rob, thank you very much. I don't know if you heard this story that we're going to go to now, just before we talk about vaccines, about the MLA on Vancouver Island who ended up in a tussle with a deer.
I did not.
You did not.
No.
Do stay tuned. I don't know if you've ever had like a scary
tussle with a deer.
Tussle with a deer. You have bucked that trend, have you? I was waiting.
Yes.
I was waiting to use that. But, I don't know if you've ever had
I try to avoid wildlife.
Animal encounter.
I don't know,
you just stay indoors.
Yes,
stay on the tennis court.
That's right.
I've come across a coyote, and I do hear them outside at night.
We have a lot of raccoons in our neighborhood. The occasional coyote. The raccoons actually are quite scary, right? Sometimes they get quite large and
they
ominous.
Really can. I'm sure we've had a story or two on our newscast about it, but we're going to hear about this deer encounter in a moment. You stay tuned for that. Thank you very much.
Sure.
Rob Zimmerman in the CBC Vancouver newsroom. And yes, on CBC. Coming up in just a few minutes, we will talk to two medical experts about the updated COVID-19 vaccines and take your questions on that and how you can protect yourself as we are entering respiratory illness season, as well as influenza and RSV as well. So we will take your calls coming up in a few minutes. But yes, we here in BC are no strangers to animal encounters, but here's this story of an entanglement that a Vancouver Island MLA won't soon forget. Now, the MLA for Parksville-Qualicum is recovering after tussling with a deer. This happened late last week. Now, earlier in the day, the MLA, Adam Walker, had helped the deer, which had gotten caught in some tree branches. Walker went on with his day, but then later came home to find the deer attacking his dog. Walker stepped in and pulled the deer away. The dog ran off, but Walker spent the next 20 minutes trying to wrest himself free from the deer. It even impaled him in the thigh. Here's Walker describing what happened to host Jason D'Souza on CBC Radio's All Points West.
I'm on my knees at this point. I've got my legs bleeding. I'm on my knees holding onto this rack and driving the antlers into the gravel because then it can't come after me. Wow. And just holding on for dear life, trying to keep these big pointy things away from any sensitive parts of me. And so my neighbor comes over. I don't want to say her age on the radio, but she comes over with her 2-year-old grandson. I don't know what was more shocking for me seeing her or her seeing me. But yeah, we got her in the car, and it took a bit of navigating, but we managed to, me holding on to the front end of this animal, sort of navigating it while the car sort of slowly nudged it into this irrigation ditch. And once it lost its footing, it just got up and left. But that was a harrowing 20 minutes or so.
And how are you doing? You mentioned it kind of impaled you in the thigh, and it was a 20-minute tangle. I mean, that must have been exhausting.
I couldn't stand afterwards, not because of my injuries. I was just so darn tired. But I'm doing fine. I mean, I got a bit of a limp. I'll be fine in a week, I'm sure. It's, I wouldn't wish it on anyone, that's for sure.
Have you ever experienced anything like this with a deer in the wild before?
No, there's no pattern here.
Glad to hear there's no pattern of those entanglements with deers. That's Adam Walker, the MLA for Parksville Qualicum. He was speaking to CBC's Jason D'Souza on All Points West. It's 12:37 now, 1:37 in the Mountain Time Zone. Well, Health Canada has approved an updated version of Moderna's vaccine to protect against COVID-19. It will be available to all Canadians over the age of 6 months. And that's expected that the new booster shots will roll out in Canada in the autumn. Canada's Chief Public Health Officer, Dr. Theresa Tam, spoke at a news conference this morning.
Preliminary clinical data have shown promising immune responses from the XBB.1.5 vaccine, the vaccine receiving regulatory authorization today, against various Omicron sublineages, including EG.5 and BA.2.86. This improved immune response is expected to better protect against the strains that are circulating in our communities. It has been more than 6 months since your last dose of COVID-19 vaccine or your last infection, your protection from the virus may have waned. Receiving a COVID-19 vaccine dose this fall with an updated formulation is expected to increase individual protection against infection, symptoms, and severe disease.
That was Canada's Chief Public Health Officer, Dr. Theresa Tam. And yesterday, I spoke to BC's Provincial Health Officer, Dr. Bonnie Henry. She encouraged British Columbians to stay updated on when they are eligible to receive this shot.
I have confidence that the new vaccines, the updated vaccines, are going to be our best protection against what we're seeing circulating around Canada and in BC in the coming months. So I really encourage everybody to get that updated booster as soon as it's approved and available, and we expect it'll be in the province in the next couple of weeks.
Well, we're taking your questions on this. Health Canada has now approved Moderna's updated COVID-19 vaccine for all Canadians 6 months and older, while 2 other options, Pfizer and Novavax, remain waiting for approval. And officials are aiming to avoid that so-called triple-demic of COVID, RSV, and influenza that happened last year. So you can call us with your questions about these updated COVID vaccines and the upcoming vaccines as well. What do you want to know about staying healthy during respiratory illness season? And for your kids as well, you can give us a call, 1-800-825-5950, 604-669-3733. You can hit pound 690 on your cell phone. Our email is bctoday@cbc.ca. And I have 2 guests with me now. By Zoom, we're joined by Dr. Srinivas Murthy, an infectious diseases doctor and associate professor of pediatrics at UBC. Also joining us is Dr. Iris Gorfinkel, a family physician and clinical researcher and a regular medical contributor on CBC Radio. Good afternoon to you both. Thanks for joining us.
A warm good afternoon to you.
This feels like what we were doing perhaps a year or two ago, having you both on, having you on individually to take questions from our listeners. Dr. Gorfinkel, this was the news today that Health Canada has approved this updated COVID-19 vaccine. What is your big takeaway from that?
I'm really excited by it. This is one of our best protections against hospitalizations and severe illness. And it comes just on time because our immunity is waning. Whether that immunity came from previous vaccination or having had the disease, the immunity is falling, especially for those who are at high risk, people over 65 with comorbidities, racialized communities, pregnant women. So this comes as a tremendous good news and good timing as we're just now seeing an uptick in hospitalizations.
And Dr. Murthy, what about for you? Yeah, the timing of it. We spoke with Dr. Henry yesterday saying we have seen an uptick in cases in BC, although she was not surprised by it. She expected ebbs and flows in cases and that this was still a better position than last year. But what do you make of the timing of this? Is it just in time? Are we kind of getting a little late here?
No, it's a great time. I think, as you mentioned in the intro, this triple-demic is what we're hoping to avoid. And so if we have an effective vaccine, this XBB targeted variant vaccine, it's great to get it rolled out into the community. It also speaks, I think, to the nimbleness of the entire operation. This specific variant was mentioned just in June, July, as being the one to target with this vaccine, and Moderna, Pfizer, Novavax have all put their acts together to get this vaccine operational for this season. And so it's an exciting time for this vaccine to roll out.
Okay, we are taking questions on this vaccine and any other of the upcoming vaccines as well, and how you can stay safe and healthy during this upcoming respiratory illness season, and how we can avoid that triple-demic that we've been talking about. We'd love to hear from you. 1-800-825-5950, 604-669-3733. Pound 690 on your cell phone. My guests, Dr. Iris Gorfinkel and Dr. Srinivas Murthy. By email, we have a question from Susan, who's asking, will a new Pfizer vaccine be available? My previous 4 vaccines have been Pfizer, and I've had no negative effects from it. I've heard stories from several friends who've had negative reactions to the Moderna vaccine, so I'm hesitant to get that one. Susan, thank you for your email. Who would like to take that? Dr. Gorfinkel.
Yeah, I'm happy to answer that. So Health Canada is now looking at Pfizer's application. I think it's reasonable to expect that it will be approved very shortly. We know that the FDA in the United States approved it just yesterday, so it is an important addition to our armamentarium. Now, what about vaccine efficacy? The two have actually fairly equivalent.
Okay, and regardless of what variant it's going to be?
Well, both Moderna and Pfizer have, by their own research, demonstrated good neutralizing antibodies to all 3 of the concerns that we have. So XBB 1.5 is what it was originally aimed at, but their research has shown that it is also a good against EG.5 and also BA 2.86. Now, that's a bit of a dark horse because we don't see a lot of that in Canada. The vast majority are coming from those first 2.
Okay, we have the one case in BC that's been confirmed as far as I know. Let's take a question on the phone from Sue, who's joining us in Lantzville. Hi there, Sue. Welcome.
Hi, thanks for taking my call.
Sure.
I have a question about the reliability of the rapid antigen tests with the new variants. And the reason I'm asking is because I had an illness that I'm pretty sure was COVID about 3 weeks ago. It lasted for 3 weeks. And it's important to me because I need to know the timing of a booster, if I'm to get a booster, as to when I last had COVID.
Yeah, that's a good question, Sue. And what we heard from this morning, I believe, was 6 months following your last infection and last vaccination. So that is a very good question. If you want to hold the line, let's ask Dr. Murthy about that. How effective are those rapid tests when it comes to the new variants?
Yeah, it's a great question that we've all been sort of wrestling with over the past 3.5 years as new variants have emerged, and the rapid tests have been our primary mode of diagnosis. As more variants emerge, we are seeing that they're less useful, specifically the rapid antigen tests, but still useful enough. And so with XBB first emerging, I think the studies showed around 80% reliability for detection. That being said, back to the original question, the 6 months is not a hard and fast rule. And per some documentation, if it's earlier than that by a few weeks or months, it's actually okay. As long as that's 3 to 6 months is probably a reasonable time frame to start considering getting that extra dose from previous infection.
Okay, so given that that is the guideline that Sue's going by, perhaps that can be, there's a little bit of leeway there. Is there another option for her to find out at this point whether that was COVID or not?
Not really. That's clinically available right now. Given the exposure she's probably had to vaccines and other things, getting a test for antibodies to see if she has been exposed is not something that we routinely do.
Okay. Dr. Gorfinkel, what are your thoughts as well?
You know, coming back to the testing, the Toronto Ontario Science Advisory Table recommends what I call the 5x5 rule. So when testing, it's important to test in multiple areas. The instructions say just test in the nose, deep in the nostrils, but that's not going to be adequate. Because Omicron is better at escaping tests, it's important to pick up the virus from multiple areas if possible, including the lower gums, 5 seconds in each place, the back of the throat, 5 seconds, the same swab in the nose as deep as it can go, each side for 5 seconds. So it's called the 5x5 rule of testing. And if that test is negative, the test should be repeated every 2 days. If it's a positive test, it's COVID. If it's a negative test, it doesn't necessarily rule it out because as we've seen, it is better at escaping tests.
Okay, thank you very much for that very good question, Sue. Our number again, 1-800-825-5950, 604-669-3733. So some guidance there in terms of the timing. Then if you're considering, if you're planning for when to get your booster shot, and as well how to use the test to ensure that you get a more accurate result. Lisa is asking us by email, if someone hasn't been vaccinated yet, could they get this new vaccine and forego all the previous boosters? Dr. Gorfinkel first, and then we'll go to Dr. Morty.
So Moderna has issued a statement on just this. They are now recommending that the old vaccine, the bivalent vaccine, no longer be used, and that this vaccine be used. So if somebody is vaccine naive and has not had a vaccine previously, they're recommended at this point to get 1 dose of Moderna's vaccine. That's not going to be the rule for Pfizer. Pfizer is recommending added doses, but Moderna is recommending a single dose at this point. But stay tuned. I mean, that can easily change. We actually don't know just yet. We're going to see what happens with a much broader data set now that it's being given both in the United States and in Canada.
Okay, but at this point, what Moderna is saying is get this shot. Dr. Morley, how is this vaccine different than from previous ones?
So this one is very specific. It's a targeted monovalent, which means against one specific part of the spike protein. It's called XBB.1.5. It's different in that it's just targeting that individual one, not the original strain that was first isolated in Wuhan back in January of 2020. It can be used as the primary series going forward, and I'd like to congratulate the caller or the emailer for starting to consider getting vaccinated as part of the primary series now. It's always exciting to hear that. And NACI, the national guideline body, has said specifically that those individuals should receive this vaccine as their primary series going forward.
Okay, thank you as well for that question. Pam in Langley called in with a question on our phones, and this is the question she's posing. I'm in my 70s, and I got my last booster in July. Timing suggests I shouldn't get another booster until December or so, but given the new Moderna vaccine is now going to be made available, could I consider getting this vaccine sooner? So there was that timeline that you were talking about, Dr. Murthy. What would you say then to someone who wants to get it sooner than the 6 months? You were saying 3 to 6 months as well.
Yeah, so there's no safety problem with getting it anywhere between 3 to 6 months. And NACI, the national guideline body, has specifically mentioned those individuals who are interested in getting this can get it earlier than the 6-month interval. The 6-month interval is the recommendation, but if individuals want to get it earlier, I wouldn't get any earlier than 3 months compared to the previous vaccine, but 3 to 6 months is not an unreasonable thing to pursue.
Can I ask you both, we've been using the term booster. We heard that this morning, but we've also heard there's some question around not calling it a booster shot. Why is that? What is the messaging around that? Why is that important? Dr. Gorfinkel?
It's because the new vaccine from Moderna and this new one that may be approved from Pfizer as well is quite a departure from the previous vaccines. So the previous vaccines had at least some, including the bivalent, of the messenger RNA aimed at the original spike protein. What we have now is a monovalent vaccine aimed at XBB 1.5 that's also good for EG.5. Those are the main variants now circulating in Canada. So this is a departure from what was. And they're saying, well, we should look at this more like an annual vaccine. In days of yore, we could look back and say, gosh, we have one main variant. Now, if you take a look, it's actually a series of many different variants. So like influenza, in this sense only, the vaccine is likely going to be an annual event. And this year's annual event happens to land on XBB 1.5 and EG.5, primarily Omicron.
And Dr. Murthy, do you see that then, that every year these companies will have to keep working, based on what kinds of variants are being seen around there, being detected?
I think knowing what's going to happen with COVID-19 in the future is a fool's errand. I can't necessarily say in 1 year we'll need another vaccine based on the circulating variants that may emerge at that point in time. I'd say there will be periodic, not boosting, but regular vaccine intervals that we'll have to have. I don't know what those intervals are. I don't know how frequently we'll need to update it based on the mutation rate of coronavirus 19, but we'll see.
And Dr. Gorfinkel referred to the flu vaccine that we get annually. Do you both know how effective is the flu vaccine going to be this year?
One can only know that in retrospect. So that data we have so far is coming out of Australia. And this year, Australia had a very similar year to what it had last year. In other words, way more infections, because in 2020 and 2021 to 2022, there was very few infections. But now, of course, we're back to our regular. And children were especially hit hard. Now, that's not unusual, but about 3/4 of the cases in Australia were in children. And the hospitalizations were also largely in children this year.
From the flu?
From influenza, that's
influenza.
correct. That's
Wow.
not to be related to kids not getting vaccinated enough.
Okay, well, let me just put out the numbers once more before the end of the half hour. 1-800-825-5950, 604-669-3733. You can hit pound 690 as well. Your questions on the new updated Moderna vaccine that's just been approved by Health Canada. And any other questions you have about staying healthy as we enter the respiratory illness season. Dr. Murthy, you're a professor of pediatric medicine. What should parents keep in mind for their children, whether it is avoiding influenza, this new vaccine as well that is approved already for people older than 6 months?
Yeah, and so like you mentioned at the beginning, this triple-demic, let's say, with RSV, influenza, and COVID-19. And now that we're getting vaccines for all of those, the RSV vaccine is likely going to roll out in Canada over the next 6 months or so. The influenza vaccine as discussed, and COVID-19 updates, which is an exciting time for protection, acknowledging that our pediatric vaccination rate against COVID-19 is not very high, especially over the past couple of years after that initial surge in 2021. And so we'll have to consider what the best public relations messaging is for childhood coronavirus vaccines and how to best sort of navigate that.
Okay, we have some more questions by email here I'd like to get to. Nicola asks, I'll put this to you, Dr. Murthy, because you're based in BC. Nicola writes, I can't remember how long it is since my last one. Will we get reminders. I don't know if you're plugged into how that will all be rolled out, but Dr. Henry did say we'll get notifications, right?
Yes, I believe she said that, and I believe the process is underway to get those notifications out, particularly for the higher risk individuals who are targeted by these nasty recommendations that emerged today. So I believe that's the case, although don't quote me on that one.
We do have as well, Nicola, the interview with Dr. Bonnie Henry online. You can go to YouTube at CBC Vancouver and watch that. We did ask her those questions, and she said, wait for those notifications. Glenn asks us, if I'm healthy and over 60, should I get this vaccine? Dr. Gorfinkel? Dr. Gorfinkel, are you there? Oh, yes. Well, let's just get the audio up on Dr. Gorfinkel there.
Thank you.
Yes.
So, Glenn, thank you for your question. So it was, if I'm over 60 and healthy, do I need to get the vaccine? My advice would be you should get the vaccine. And it's not just because you're so worried about hospitalization in ICU. That's only one aspect of being protected against COVID-19. There's a dark horse here, too. In the background lurking, 1 in 10 individuals so far have long COVID symptoms. And that should not be underestimated. In my own practice, I have many patients struggling with it. And this is a condition for which we have no cure, for which we know that for every time a person gets that disease, it raises the possibility of having long COVID. It increases that possibility. And in my view, we need to do everything possible to try to prevent that from happening. Hand washing, masking when possible, especially in crowded spaces with low ceilings. And we have to take all of our potential protections seriously because no one of them is perfect.
And in our last 30 seconds here, Dr. Murty, your advice then to people to avoid, all these things, right? COVID, RSV, and the flu.
Yeah, I think people have heard a lot of messages over the past 3.5 years about how to protect themselves, and a lot of those messages persist, making sure we keep ourselves safe with vaccinations and other things to protect ourselves, but also air quality and other more systemic things that we can continue to advocate for at the system level.
Thank you so much to both of you for your time.
Many thanks.
Dr. Iris Gorfinkel, family physician and clinical researcher, a contributor here to CBC. Dr. Srinivas Murthy, infectious diseases doctor. That's it for our show today. And going back to the Beyonce concert again last night, look at all these fantastic photos from Ben Nelms of people who were decked out. I'm Michelle Eliot. Thanks for joining us.